Hi, Janina.
Hello, Luciana. So nice to see you.
Oh, great that you're here. Thank you for spending this time with us. Um, so we have a few questions to ask you, and I guess we would start with, the beginning, how you first became interested in the field of psychology, and more specifically trauma.
Oh my goodness. Well, I became interested in the field of psychology because I had children. And I had children shortly after getting my university degree. And I realized that a university degree was absolutely useless when it came to figuring out how to care for a baby and be a competent mother. So I could write an English paper quite well, but the business of being a mother is quite different. So that led me into the field. And then I was inspired by hearing Judith Herman in 1989 talk about, I remember she said, doesn't it make more sense that we suffer because of what has happened to us than we suffer because of our infantile fantasies? Because, of course, the 1980s were the kind of the height of Freudian talking therapy in the US. And so I thought, yes, it makes much more sense that people suffer because of what was done to them than because of their infantile fantasies. And it was like light bulbs and flashing lights went off, and I realized, okay, this is my field. So I was very lucky because I was able to study with Judith Herman. So there were two pioneers in the trauma field in those years, Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk. So I had the great good fortune to do a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship with Judy Herman, and then to go to Bessel van der Kolk's clinic to become a supervisor. And that we were on a train that was moving. The field of trauma was developing as the need for it became more and more dramatic, not just obvious, but dramatic.
I have another question to follow on from that, but I'm curious about how that impacted your ability to parent and
luckily,
what motivated you to get involved. How did
at that point, I started my doctoral program when my children, I think, were 8 and 10. So by the time I was going into the trauma field, they were teenagers, and they were all off to university and so on. Because I couldn't have done both. I thought, how could you ever be a therapist and be a young mother? You would be a wreck.
And could you say a little about how your approach to trauma developed? I know that you've got your very own approach to working with trauma, and that you also have a background. You mentioned Bessel and Judith Herman, but you also have a background in sensory motor psychotherapy and internal family systems. How did all of that come together?
Well, I have to give Bessel van der Kolk a great deal of the credit, because he pushed me to train in EMDR. Then he pushed me, and all his staff, not me personally, he pushed us all to learn how to work with the body, because he believed that the body keeps the score. So there was the inspiration, and as well as some pressure if we were going to treat trauma, we had to learn how to treat the body. So all of that, the field was growing, we grew, and as you know, I think every therapist finds what they need to learn from their clients. And so, I would know enough to help more people, and then there'd be all kinds of things that I didn't know how to work with, couldn't help people resolve. So I'd have to learn more to help the next group and the next group. And my PARTS approach, called trauma-informed stabilization treatment, or TIST, that developed because I started getting cases of very severe dissociation. Starting in 1989, I had my first dissociative identity disorder client assigned to me at the hospital where I was training. And so before I knew it, in those days, in the 80s and 90s, if you had seen one client with DID, you were an expert because most therapists had never treated a DID client. So then all the other DID clients get referred to you. And I had to scramble to figure out how to treat them. And I think that's really the life of a therapist. So I became very interested in PARTS, thanks to really seeing, that's the wonderful thing about DID. You see the human psyche more externalized. Because rather than the parts being thoughts and feelings and ego states, they actually come out and talk to the therapist. And so I was inspired by that. I was inspired by the development of the structural dissociation model, which is the work of Anno van der Hart, and really thinking, it would take you 3 months at Bessel's van der Kolk's clinic to become interested in the brain and to be unable to think about anything without thinking about the brain. So this idea that dissociation is not random and it's not connected to different memories held in little time capsules. The idea that dissociation exists to help us survive was a very powerful idea. And a very different way of working with parts than in IFS or in traditional models of DID, where the whole emphasis is on finding the wounded part and getting that part to download their memories.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about this difference between IFS and what the unburdening or the downloading and your approach?
Well, again, in the years that brain research was teaching us more and more about trauma, one of the things we learned, thanks to a study by Bessel van der Kolk, is that being able to put the events into words didn't change the suffering. So he did a very brilliant study of 2 groups of trauma survivors who'd all survived the same type of trauma, which was waking up in the middle of surgery out of anesthetic. And he divided them into 2 groups, one group that could put the experience into words, which is what we'd been taught, right? And one group that couldn't bear to think about it or talk about it. And they compared the symptoms and difficulties of the 2 groups. They were identical. Being able to put it into words didn't do anything to reduce the symptoms and difficulties. So I began to question, why were we so bent on getting people to tell their stories if that wasn't helpful? Why were we asking people what happened to them instead of how it had affected them? Okay? Now, if you were in a motor accident, I wouldn't ask you, tell me exactly how it happened. I'd say, how are you doing? Are you all right? Do you have any injuries? Have there been after effects? right? Somehow we had this idea that the event was more important than how it affected people. So I wanted to develop a model that focused on how events affected individuals rather than on the event. I also thought I had lots of ideas and very little credibility. Just like all therapists, no one knew my name. I had these ideas, but sometimes I was a little afraid to voice them because I thought people will think I'm a crackpot. I also thought there was something fundamentally wrong with the idea that people had to suffer in order to heal. That trauma treatment meant you go through the fiery furnace of what happened to you, you relive it, you feel the feelings, and then you get better. It just didn't make any sense. Why should people who have suffered have to suffer more in order to heal? Can't we possibly find ways that they can heal without having to suffer all over again? So that was one of the things I didn't say much in public because it was so, at the time, revolutionary, and obviously the idea that people shouldn't suffer in psychotherapy was not a popular idea.
Well, bit by bit, increasingly accepted, isn't it?
Yes, isn't it? That's how lovely it's been to have the whole field change in a way that does emphasize the things that I thought were more important than the things we were doing, 20, 30 years ago.
And how would you like to see it change more? What do you feel is important for therapists working with?
Wow, great question. That's a feast. Well, of course, I would love for the field to become more comfortable with dissociation. It's still a bad word. It's still a very stigmatizing word. I don't think it has to be. Dissociation is natural. People can't do it on purpose. It's something the brain does. And I think I call it the phobia of dissociation, means that people who have dissociative symptoms and disorders don't get the care that they need. And then the other thing, I have a bunch of things.
We want to hear all of them.
The other thing that has been a pet peeve of mine for decades is the stigma put on borderline personality disorder. Actually, on all personality disorders, but especially borderline. I remember in 1990, the first research study, showed that in this particular study, 85% of clients who had a borderline personality diagnosis had histories of childhood trauma. And there have been study after study that shows this very strong association over and over again. We even have studies that can predict borderline personality disorder from looking at a child's attachment status at age 1. So do we really need more proof that borderline personality is a trauma disorder, not a personality disorder? So that's one of the big things I'd like to influence. And then my model, a trauma-informed stabilization treatment, or TIST, has been extraordinarily effective with very severe borderline cases with dissociative disorders. And I would like, this is kind of my dream for my remaining years in the field, I would like to be able to train more hospital wards, clinics in the use of this method, because it makes such a difference, especially when we're working with the more severe clients, the suicidal clients, the self-injuring clients, the eating disordered clients with addictions. It makes a huge difference.
There's so much to ask you. It's hard to kind of know where to go. But could you say that you've got a particular interest? Is that right, in addictive behaviours and eating disorders, or you've done quite a lot of work with those two conditions? Could you say a little about your interest in that and your work with it?
Well, it's. I mean, first of all, if you actually look at studies of individuals in addictions treatment, and you ask them if they were ever abused as children, an enormous percent have histories of childhood trauma. So that's more than a coincidence. Quite a substantial percent of eating disorder clients also have histories of trauma, not quite as high as for the addictions group. And again, we know that eating disorders and addictions are among the most difficult conditions to treat. And we have people who are at life risk, who relapse over and over again. I've had so many eating disorder clients who were in a revolving door. They'd go into an eating disorder program, they would do better. A week or two later, after they'd left the program, they were starving themselves again.
Why is it that you think eating disorders are particularly hard to treat?
Well, what I've come to understand, thanks to the brain and body understanding I have, is that what eating disorders do is they numb the body. And so if restricting food, as in anorexia, not only numbs the body, but it also gives the individual a burst of energy, because you put the body into a state of ketosis by starving it, and then you get a burst of energy. And so it's really, in a way, it's quite seductive. Imagine if every day you felt numb to painful feelings and you had all this energy. It's very, very seductive. So, and when you're running from your feelings, you don't think, oh, well, if I lose more weight, I'm going to put a strain on my heart, because there's this fleeing from emotion. Bulimia is very similar. Overeating or binging also causes numbing of the body. Purging relieves a little of the numbing, but after purging, people fall into a very, very profound, sort of sedated state. And so when I interviewed bulimics, it turned out that many of them binged and purged in order to sleep. So if you're waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares, you just binge and purge and put yourself right back to sleep. Overeating, as we all know, from Christmas dinner or from other holiday meals, puts people into a relaxed, numb, sort of spacey state. And so doesn't it make sense that the trauma survivors would crave those states? And so it really, as it turns out, anorexia in particular doesn't really have anything to do with body image. That's the story, the rationale that makes a case for the behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I know it in my own work with clients from all of the training that I've done with you and the supervision, how extraordinarily helpful it has been to be able to frame to clients what's happening in terms of parts, and so non-pathologizing for clients to be able to think of their addictive behavior, you know, be that a substance or whatever it may be, in terms of a part that's trying its best to manage the really uncomfortable symptoms of trauma. It's just phenomenally helpful. It seems so simple, but it creates this enormous shift in
It
someone.
does. It does.
It's so
And that's what I
powerful.
found when I first tried it out in a hospital for the chronically mentally ill. And we were given as guinea pigs the 4 or 5 most severe cases in this hospital for the chronically mentally ill. Clients who were trying to take their life while in hospital, who were self-injuring, who were starving themselves. And I remember the first time that the most severe of these severe clients said, oh, you know, I really wanted to self-harm myself today, but I just kept saying, she said, I just kept saying, that's the fight part. I don't have to do what it wants. And she was able to gain control over the self-harm, which had resulted in her being scarred from her neck down. Her entire body was covered with scars, but as long as she kept thinking, oh, that's just the part that cuts, she could, it wasn't her impulse, so she didn't have to give in to it.
Yeah, and I know that one of the particular qualities, the way that you work, is that there's this kind of gentle yet relentless approach to communicating with the parts or about the parts. And you know, an extraordinary empathy really for these often quite determined, powerful parts. Could you say a bit more about that? The relentless yet gentle manner
Yes.
in which you kind of
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's interesting because, of course, most therapists, if they're working with suicidal or self-harming clients, tend to be pretty focused on ensuring safety. But when I talk about relentless, it's a very gentle, consistent focus on the parts. The client, actually, I have a client right now who's in the midst of this. And she'll say, I just want to give up. And I say, oh, notice the giving up part is very vocal today. No, I want to give up. Notice the giving up part is so loud that it feels like it's your feeling. You know, and then she'll go on to say, so I think the suicidal part is just going to go with that. So as long as I'm giving up the suicidal part, will carry out its plan. And so then I have to very relentlessly say, so when the giving up part insists that the only thing it can do is give up, the suicidal part threatens to kill everybody. And the cost, no, the suicidal part is just trying to help. Okay, so the suicidal part is just trying to help. And is it trying to help the giving up part? Is it trying to help you? And so the discussion becomes not whether the client is going to live or die. I've spent hundreds of hours sitting with clients as they struggled with this. Well, should I live? What's the point of living? Why won't anybody let me die? Conversations that are never lead to anything productive. And somehow as long as we're noticing the suicidal part as a part, it can actually become very productive.
It's such a different model, isn't it, from
Such a different model.
conventional talking therapy, in terms of you know, the emphasis on interpretation and so on. It's very, very different, isn't it? I mean, it's quite a shift for therapists.
It is quite a shift, but you know, in my training program, which I ran for the first time this year, I did an online training program in this model. And the vast majority of the therapists in the class said that they were amazed at how their clients responded. And I get that feedback from my book, from Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors. Really, a week doesn't go by when I get an email thanking me. You know, dear Dr. Fisher, I have struggled. You know, I've had terrible trauma my whole life. I've struggled with getting help. I've struggled with functioning. I've struggled in relationships. And I've never understood what was wrong with me until I read your book. Thank you so much for helping me understand myself and see how I could get to a better place. So I feel that, you know, in the end, it's the endorsement from the consumers, i.e. the clients, that's most important.
Yeah, I mean, that must be so rewarding.
It's wonderful. It really makes me feel like, well, that's why I did it. As much as I love to help therapists, in the end, our mission, all of our missions, is to help the clients.
And it's been my experience too, I have to say, you know, that your work and my time training with you fundamentally changed my practice with clients. I mean, it really did. And it is so effective.
Yeah, it's so surprisingly. and I love the fact that they don't have to work so hard and I don't have to work so hard, because it's a very gentle, mindful approach.
Good. Coming back to parts, could you say a little bit about what it is that's happening in someone's childhood, in the psyche, where these parts, you know, are developing, and how that happens? I mean, I know some of that's mysterious, but could you say a little bit more about that process, the fragmentation?
Well, you know, some theorists believe that we're born fragmented. And that's why babies can change states from, you know, I am furious and miserable, to I am the happiest baby in the world, to I'm a mischievous little thing who is going to get that phone one way or another, right? That babies have these shifts in personality, and that's over the course of good attachment that those different states become more integrated, so that then the child, let's say the 5-year-old, can be upset, but doesn't become the full-blown screaming baby, can shift into a I'm still upset but not hysterical state, right? Can be angry and reasonable at the same time. And it's really child development that allows us to become more integrated. So that's one theory. And of course, in a traumatic environment, there's not going to be any help integrating those states. Then the theory of Onno van der Hart is that because the brain is fragmented, so to speak, you know, the brain consists of different structures. We call it the brain, but in fact, what is a brain? A brain is a set of many structures, small and larger, with different functions that communicate with each other via neural networks. So the Anna van der Hart theory says you already have a brain with different structures. In the context of a traumatic environment, whether it's war or child abuse, those different structures become less communicative. And or the structures that communicate are organized towards survival. Because really, survival for traumatized children is not dependent on being integrated, right? It's dependent on being able to be the right child at the right time to lessen the risk. So if it lessens the risk to be a silly child, even if you're scared to death, right? Those are two very different states. Then a little dissociation or fragmentation allows you to be terrified inside while being the silly child who engages the grown-ups, or the, very good caretaking parentified child can be angry one state and do all the parentified behavior in another state. So it's very, very adaptive to be able to be the safest possible person moment to moment.
Mm-hmm. And so what does healing from trauma mean to you? What do you feel that it looks like?
So that was one of the questions that actually came up among a group of colleagues. And that they asked me, they were members of a collegial peer supervision group, and they asked me to create a little didactic on what healing means. And so when I started thinking about what does healing mean, we throw that word around as if we know what it means. And I thought, well, really, people don't feel healed as a result of processing some horrific memory. They may feel exhausted, they may feel relieved, but they don't feel healed. And so I thought, well, when do we feel healed? And I thought, well, we feel healed the moment that we unconditionally accept, forgive ourselves, offer compassion to ourselves, embrace ourselves warmly instead of blaming. It was my fault. It was my shame. I'm hopelessly victimized and there's no other life for me. So I thought, okay, we have to have a method that ends with people feeling that warm sense of acceptance of their parts and of themselves. And that's healing. And so then when it was very easy with the parts model to focus on issues of safety and stability. Then the question was, how do you take a parts model to the next stage, which is the healing part? Again, I'm very influenced by internal family systems, but when I used an internal family systems approach to helping my clients heal, it didn't work as successfully as I had hoped, because again, it was more event focused. So I began working on a way of healing that asked the question, what do these young wounded parts need to feel safe now, to feel welcome now, to feel respected, to to feel, to have a right to their boundaries. And then I had to figure out how to help my clients offer those things to their child parts. And it can be very lovely. I've worked with many people who had tremendous difficulty setting boundaries. And when they realized that their failure to set boundaries was harming their traumatized child parts and maintaining the sense of fear and foreboding, they were really motivated to become better boundaries, just as one does for one's own children, right? I certainly recall learning so many things as a parent because I realized I have to learn this because my children need me to learn it. So that's the same kind of thing where the child parts have a relationship with the adult the client is today, who is not anything like the perpetrators or non-offending parents, right? It's someone who is willing to learn, is willing to protect the child parts, is willing to communicate compassion and understanding rather than pull your socks up and be done with it.
Do you think that sometimes there's a need for processing an event in order to get to that place where that feels more possible for a client? Let's say in certain situations, an abuse or something, and their nervous system is not completed certain fight or flight responses related to the abuse. Do you think that could be necessary to process that and allow the body to complete those responses in order to then be able to meet the part?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I've done a lot of that kind of work with DID clients, working with the body rather than with the parts. And it hasn't had the effect that it has on clients without dissociative disorders, where you can, I'm thinking of a client where we processed an assault, completed a defensive response, and she has felt the benefits of that 10 years later. Whenever I encounter her, she says, I will always remember that session because it changed my life. I've had many, many of those sessions with my DID client, whom I call Annie, but she suffered in her life hundreds, if not thousands, of acts of abuse by 50 or more perpetrators, right? So you can't process hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of events by multiple perpetrators, including group events. It's just not possible. So and I think there are all too many of those clients who suffered. They might not have had as many different perpetrators as Annie, but they certainly suffered hundreds of traumatic events. How do you process that? To me, what I think of is we process the impact on these child parts. Right, so I can help the client empower the fight part that's usually suicidal and self-destructive to be a kind of somatic resource. So I love to do the work where we invite the fight part to bring its energy and strength into the body when the client is feeling wobbly. And clients are just amazed. Wow, this is a hugely different experience. But in that, we're inviting the fight part to use the body as a source of strength. So actually, you're making me think that really maybe the work is, which I still haven't developed as well as I'd like, to see what it's like for those protector parts, to do some of those, to do what in sensory motor psychotherapy we call sequencing or reorganizing active defenses, and see if that's different, if it's very specifically geared as an intervention the client does with the part. Mm. And you can see in my model, the therapist is not so important. I mean, of course, we're crucial, but the emphasis is on the relationship between the client and the part. Because the client can't live with me for the rest of her or his life, but will have to live with the part.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful shift. I just think that's so much more empowering for the clients.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And then, of course, it also is, I think, very important for the longevity of the therapist, because we have to feel that we can stimulate and support a healing process and see people able to go on, rather than feeling that we bear the burden of responsibility for someone for decades.
Yeah, I was going to ask whether you have certain practices that you do, before or during or after sessions with clients, so that you're more able to be present, or you're able to process some of the client's difficult material that you might be impacted by. Are there certain things you do to kind of to help you in your role?
Most of what I do is I do in the moment with the client. So I laugh a lot. I work in mindfulness so that I'm not so I have a different relationship to the client's experience. As a psychodynamically trained therapist, I was taught you have to go there to the heart of darkness with the client. Clients have told me for 40 years, don't go to the heart of darkness with us. We don't want that. Right? I remember someone saying, I like a therapist who doesn't seem shocked, horrified, or overwhelmed by what I'm telling her. Right? Which makes perfect sense. Right? The old idea that empathy has to mean that we feel each blow as the client felt it just is not what the traumatized clients say they need. And it makes a huge difference. I'm not quite sure why, if our empathy is for what the part suffered. Right? That because then the client can have empathy for the part too. And that's important. Here's another wonderful influence by my client, Annie. 2 years ago, she said, why is it that therapists are so interested in the gory details of what's happened to us? Why don't they just ask us how we survived? And I thought, this is actually a wonderful question. Why don't we ask, how did you survive? Right? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you think some of the most common misconceptions about trauma are.
I think most therapists feel guilty if they don't address the event memories. That's the impression I get from talking to therapists, which is why Annie's thought, why don't they just ask us how we survived? Because when you ask a client how did you survive, they have a chance to tell you as much or as little about what they survived. But the emphasis is on they survived, rather than the emphasis being on how were you victimized, how were you humiliated, how were you heartbroken, how were you wounded. So I think that's the difference, and that shift in perspective is very good for the therapist too. Because instead of feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of what the client has been through, we can feel awe and wonder at how the client has survived. And, with very difficult clients, I try to remember, but I do it in the session, right? So I try to breathe, try to center myself, try to stay mindful. And the word I use to keep myself mindful is curious. So the bigger the reaction I'm having to the client, the more I tell myself to be curious. And curiosity is a lighter state. It's a very different mental and physical state. I also have given myself permission for many years to what's the word, to direct the focus of the session, to make it obviously respectful and attuned to the client, but to decrease the amount of pressure and stress on the therapist. So I ask people who are driven to tell me every gory detail of some event. I often ask them to just pause and put it aside, because what I figured out was, if I'm overwhelmed by their story, they are overwhelmed by it, even more overwhelmed by it. And it's not helping either of us to hear those very horrific details. So I've developed all kinds of things. I developed a policy for suicidal clients. I say to them, oh, I just want to tell you that I have a policy. I am more than willing to work with people who are suicidal, who very much want to die, as long as they are willing to live. So if you're willing to live, it's fine if you think about dying and death and suicide. But to work with me, you have to be willing to live. If you're not willing to live, I can find you another therapist who doesn't have this policy. But my policy is that people who work with me have to be willing to live. And so sometimes they get quite irritated. Well, what kind of therapist? And I say, well, I'm terribly sorry. Again, I'd be happy to find you someone who's not as fussy about your willingness to live. But that's, and so then I don't have the stress of worrying, is my client going to be alive or dead tomorrow? I can really be there with the client, knowing that we've agreed they're willing to live.
Yeah, it's such a helpful approach, because especially for people working with the more extreme end, with DID clients and people with really difficult histories, they burn out so quickly. So it just feels like
Right.
such a helpful approach, such a helpful model.
Yeah.
I know that we're kind of running out of time here. I'm going to try and squeeze in two more
Yeah.
questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I have 10 more questions. And one I can't resist asking is to do with relationships, because of course people with trauma histories, we all find relationships challenging, but
Yes.
with trauma histories, have some particular challenges, especially if they've had attachment difficulties. Could you say a little bit about one of the common dynamics that's often an anxious attachment style paired with an avoidant attachment style, and some of the difficulties that come from this pairing, and how might one be able to work with that when it shows up in a relationship?
Well, this is actually one of this topics I love, because I love to work with couples and help them to see how really the problem is that they trigger each other. So rather than the usual paradigm is the person who withdraws or who is avoidant is the bad guy in the relationship, and the person who's more emotionally expressive is the good guy. And I try to shift that. I can talk about it from many different points of view depending on the client. I could talk about how, if they're both trauma survivors, I can talk about how their nervous systems had developed two different survival strategies, and help them to see it as a nervous system problem. It's like seeing it as a part. And sometimes I do that with couples. I say, we all bring into our relationships a wounded child part of ourselves and the teenage protector of that child, right? And you don't say at the altar, right, for better or for worse, right? I hereby agree to marry all of your parts, good, bad, and ugly, right? We think we're getting one person for better or for worse. And so couples usually like that because it's really non-pathologizing. And then the withdrawal behavior or the angry, attacking, blaming partner we can relabel that behavior as the teenage protector, and keep the idea that both of these adults who made the decision to be together still can make something good out of this, but they have to do something about this wounded child and the teenage protector. Sometimes I help couples just work through the body. So I tell them, you're not allowed to talk in this therapy because the two of you don't have the ability to talk without fighting. So I just have them track their bodies, right? So as you see your wife getting ready to speak, notice what happens in your body. Do you shut down? Do you get tense? Does your heart rate increase, decrease? Right? As you get ready to talk, wife, what's happening in your body? And then they start to see that before either says a word, the speaker is ready to burst and the listener is already shutting down. And then the words make it worse. So there's so much we can do. I think the risk in couples therapy is that we let couples fight in our presence. And I don't do that. I say, you can argue for free at home. if you're working with me and paying all this money, then we're going to do it differently. And that's a lot of fun. The other thing I do is I sometimes declare the therapy session a no blame zone. And so every time one or the other starts to blame, I ring a little bell, or I say, pause for a moment, I heard blame. Remember, this is a no blame zone. And then they have to say it without blame. And it's very interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I'd love to spend a whole hour just on relationships. I mean, I think there's just so much to talk about. I'm aware of our time. I've got one last question I'm going to squeeze in, which is to do with Benjamin Fry and how you came to know him and what you think about his book, The Invisible Lion, and the work that he's doing with Kyron House, and how his work overlaps with your work, if it does.
Well, I think what Benjamin did was, and again, I haven't read the book, but I've talked about it with him. What he did from his own healing journey was to take the neuroscience research and writing of people like Bessel van der Kolk and to apply it in a language that helps the survivors understand what's going on. I mean, I think that's really his contribution, because it's fine for the neuroscientists to study the brain and write scholarly articles. It's fine for people like me or Bessel van der Kolk to try to translate those findings into suggestions for treatment. But what about simply helping people who are struggling understand themselves? And I met Benjamin because he's sort of in a very polite, professional, British way, he stalked me. He kept trying to meet me, and he drove hours to meet me at somewhere where I was presenting a workshop, to have dinner with me, to say, this is what I'm envisioning. This is the program I want to create. What do you think? Will you be an advisor? And he described the program that I'd been imagining in my own mind for years. It was amazing, right? So it will have mindfulness, it will have yoga, it will have body-centered treatment, and I just thought, this is cutting-edge trauma therapy. This is what people are talking about as an ideal model, but no one's doing it. And this gentleman, who I've never met until he drove 3 hours to have dinner with me, is describing the program I've been dreaming of for years. So that's how it began. It's been, goodness, 10 plus years, I think, since I have been involved with Kyron clinics.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was so long, right? Because I think we celebrated 10 years last year of Kyron, didn't we? Gosh, so right from near the beginning you were involved.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So I still recommend it when people write me. It's in the US, people write me and say, do you know of a treatment program for trauma that incorporates your work and the work of, Bessel van der Kolk and other experts? I say to them, well, there's no such program I can recommend in the US, but I can recommend a program in the UK. It still is a program where I can confidently say that trauma survivors will be understood and have access to cutting edge treatments.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, thank you so much, Janina. It's been really, really a privilege to have this hour chatting to you and
It's been
hearing all of
great.
your wisdom and your expertise. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, really, thank you.
my pleasure. It's fun to talk with you about, these ideas that are so important.
I mean, there's so much more that I would love to hear about. Who knows? Maybe they'll let us do another hour.
That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you.